Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. If I could have your attention, please. Sorry for interrupting your conversation, but we want to get started on our program. Good afternoon, and you're all very welcome. My name is King. I'm the Vice President for Programs and Strategic Content here at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. We're thrilled to welcome David O'Sullivan, Ambassador of the European Union to the United States, back to the Council. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for coming to talk to us today. I'd like to thank the Ireland Network for their support of this event as well, too. Today's program is on the record and will be live streamed, but please silence your phones. You may participate in our online survey. The information is going to be on the side. If you go into your browser and type in that, you can participate by asking questions online. Also, you might want to make note of a date of something big we have coming up on April 11th. We're hosting a half-day symposium on whether or not democracy is in retreat with some really big names. E.J. Dionne from the Washington Post, Arthur Brooks from the American Enterprise Institute, Larry Diamond from Stanford, and several other luminaries. I would encourage you to sign up now. It's nearly sold out. Just a brief disclaimer before today's program. For nearly a century, the Chicago Council has provided an independent, nonpartisan platform for a variety of different voices to promote deeper global understanding and active U.S. engagement in the world. The views expressed by the individuals we host are their own and do not represent the views of the Council. There are a few things more certain than the transatlantic relationship. And now that we are in more uncertain times, we're thrilled to have David O'Sullivan here to tell us what the EU and the US can expect from each other over the next 4 years. A few words about the ambassador. He's been the ambassador to the EU, of the EU to the US since November 2014. Before that, he was Chief Operating Officer of the European External Action Service, the EU Diplomatic Service. He has also occupied the roles of Director General for Trade, Secretary General of the European Commission, Head of Cabinet of Commission President Romani Prodi, and Director General for Education and Training. He began his career in the Irish Foreign Ministry and spent 4 years in the Commission delegation in Tokyo. And it is a coincidence that he's here St. Patrick's Week, right? He's not doing anything. He was in no parade that we're aware of, and there's no rugby on. So please join me in welcoming Ambassador Sullivan to our platform.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much, Niamh. And it is indeed a complete coincidence that I'm here, not just St. Patrick's Day. And I'd like to acknowledge the presence of the Irish Minister for Employment, Mary Mitchell O'Connor, and I was in Austin earlier in the week, where the Minister for Small and Medium-Sized Companies was explaining, Pat Breen was explaining that no longer do we celebrate St. Patrick's Day, but we actually celebrate St. Patrick's Week. So that gives me a broad spectrum in which to arrive in Chicago. I'm delighted to be here, and I'd like to thank Ivo Delder, Niamh, and Matthew Abbott for having made this opportunity possible, and to be back again in this forum, which I've had the honor to address on previous occasions. My last visit to Chicago was indeed very memorable because I was here just before the election, a week after Chicago was celebrating the end of the 108-year drought for the World Series, and we in Ireland were hoping to end the 118-year drought of beating New Zealand in rugby, and we had a fantastic day in Soldiers Field. The New Zealanders obligingly lost, understanding their role in this great historic occasion, and I must say we had a great Chicago moment, and I felt that the victory in the baseball was sort of reflected by an understanding of rugby which I don't think Chicago had ever previously had. And we hope that'll give some momentum to Ireland's desire to host the Rugby World Cup in 2023. But of course, I can't possibly comment on that, you'll understand, from a European perspective. I think it is very important to get out of DC. I try to do as much of that as I can, because just as I think that Americans frequently underestimate how integrated Europe has become, I sometimes think that we in Europe overestimate or underestimate the diversity of this great country. And I know that Washington is not America, and that there's huge diversity from the East Coast to the West Coast, from the North to the South. As I say, I had the pleasure to be in Austin for the last 3 days for South by Southwest, which is a very serious occasion. Vice President Šefčovič, the member of the European Commission responsible for Energy Union, one of our most important projects under this Commission, was in Washington, and he met with his counterpart, Secretary Perry, who's the Secretary of Energy, who of course was formerly the Governor of Texas. And I dropped into the conversation at the very end that I was going to Austin to South by Southwest, and the Secretary looked at my sort of boss, Vice President Šefčovič, and said, yeah, he'll tell you it's a serious thing during the day, but believe me, it's really about the parties at night. So I felt Vice President Šefčovič said, so exactly what are you doing in Austin? We did actually, for the very first time, have a European Union presence at South by Southwest, showcasing what's happening in Europe, and a lot of very exciting things are happening in the high-tech, in the creative industries. And we were very pleased to cooperate very closely with our member states. There are 11 member states who have a strong presence in South by Southwest. I should acknowledge, and I regret I should have done this to begin with, I'd like to thank Herbert Quelle, the Consul General of Germany, who is the local chair of our Consuls General. We work very closely with our member states outside of DC. We're very grateful to have the opportunity, and a number of the Consuls General are present here today, and Consul General Quelle kindly organized a meeting in his Consulate General with a number of the EU Consuls General, and this is a very important part of our outreach, and we were able to continue that in South by Southwest. What I found very interesting, by the way, in South by Southwest was the demographic that we could reach there. The average age of audiences I address in Washington tends to be 60 plus. The average age in South by Southwest was 30 minus. So we were clearly reaching a different dynamic, a different demographic in this country. And I'll continue in that vein, because tomorrow I'm going to, I will address the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana, who are having a Europe Day. And I think, you know, the message I'm trying to bring throughout the United States is the strength of this transatlantic relationship. And at this time of change, and I will come back in a moment to the new administration, but clearly when there is a change of administration, it's a moment of uncertainty, and sometimes I think you have to kind of go back to the basics of the relationship. And there are 3 anniversaries this year which I think really explain to us how important this relationship has been. The first anniversary, the 6th of April, will be 100 years since America entered the First World War. The first time in this century when American servicemen and women gave their lives in pursuit of freedom in Europe. Unfortunately, 30 years later, they were back again, and we had the Second World War and the Holocaust. And we know that after that, we decided we needed a new business model in Europe. We needed to find a new way of doing business and living and working together. And the second anniversary is this year is the 7th anniversary of General George Marshall's very famous Marshall speech, when he precisely provided a blueprint for what that new business model might look like in Europe. And indeed, it was very important for Europe because it encouraged Europeans to cooperate in building a new economy and building a new society. But by the way, there's a very interesting article in today's Financial Times by Martin Wolf pointing out that what General Marshall said was also the foundation for America's support for multilateralism, particularly in the trading system, and in moving away from the pernicious notion of bilateral trading relationships to multilateralizing that. And that was the beginnings, or the intellectual beginning, of the multilateral liberal order, which has brought us such prosperity in the last 100 years. The third anniversary, which we will celebrate in Rome on the 25th of March, is the 60th anniversary of the signing of the Treaty of Rome, which was the constitution of the European Economic Community, built on the European Coal and Steel Community, but which laid the foundations for what is now the European Union. And what a remarkable success story that has been. We started with 6 countries, a European Economic Community, a common market. We are now at 28, having brought in along the way my own country, Ireland, Denmark, the United Kingdom, who may be on the way out, but I'll come back to that later. Countries seeking a point of reference as they emerged from totalitarianism. Greece from the colonels in 1981, Spain and Portugal from Salazar and Franco in 1985, and of course the great reunification of the continent in 2004 when we brought in 10 countries formerly part of the Soviet Union or the Soviet zone of influence, followed by Bulgaria, Romania, and then Croatia. And what a remarkable achievement that has been. And firstly, it has given us, you know, the longest period of uninterrupted peace in European history. And I know when I say this, people say, oh, yeah, nobody gets that anymore. Well, forgive me, but you don't get it until you have a war. And this is a remarkable achievement. of which we can be very proud, but frankly, at every step of the way, America has been an ally and a friend in this process and has encouraged us and assisted us, and that's been very important. So it is also your achievement, and it shows that we have not squandered the sacrifice of the American servicemen and women who gave their lives in 2 world wars to help us establish peace and prosperity on the continent of Europe. Secondly, it has brought about a community of values. I don't think the European Union can claim credit for the collapse of the Berlin Wall. I do believe that we can claim credit for the fact that the collapse of that wall and the disintegration of the Soviet Empire did not result in a spiral of violence and chaos and conflict, but instead the orderly transition of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe into the thriving Western liberal democracies that we know now, with some nuances and still some disagreements here and there, but fundamentally that is what we have been able to build jointly. And membership of the European Union was a very important aspiration and point of reference for those countries as they made that transition, as we hope it will be for the countries of the Western Balkans, by the way, where, once again, I think we can continue to play that role. And of course, through all of this, we have also built, notwithstanding the ravages of the recent recession, a zone of prosperity and thriving economic activity. The European Union is, at 28 member states, is the largest market in the world. In fact, we're one of the largest economies in the world. I think when I was last here, I used to lay claim that we were the largest, and America and China were fighting for second or third place. Exchange rates have shifted that slightly. Anyway, we're all in the top 3, and we occasionally move. It's the largest, one of the largest economies in the world, the largest trading bloc in the world. It is, frankly, notwithstanding all our problems, one of the most attractive places to live in the world. If you take any index of quality of life that you like, you will consistently see European countries are way up at the top there. So while we have our problems and our challenges, and they are many, and I'm not running away from them, we have built this remarkable achievement of unity, also in diversity. And that's the point I'd like the other point I want to make about the European Union. It is sometimes pictured as a sort of homogenizing steamroller that wants to turn everyone in Europe into some amorphous European identity at the cost of our national identities. And nothing could be further from the truth. Your motto is a pluribus unum, because you wanted a common identity of American out of your diverse national origins, because everyone came from somewhere else when you started out. In Europe, we're not trying to be all one. We are trying to have multiple layers of identity. I consider myself Irish, but I'm also from Dublin. And in an Irish context, being from Dublin is different than being from Cork. So I'm Dublin, I'm Irish, and I'm European. And none of this conflicts. They are all mutually complementary. And if I may, Minister, take Ireland as an example. Ireland is an active member of the European Union, has benefited hugely economically and politically and socially from membership of the European Union. It's a transformed country from the country I knew in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. But Ireland has not lost its national identity. This week is a testimony. This is a celebration of Irishness here in Chicago. Ireland has a stronger international profile now than it ever had before it joined the European Union. So this is not a process of homogenization or denial of national identity. And when you're in Germany, you know you're in Germany. When you're in Portugal, you know you're in Portugal. You're eating Portuguese food. You're hearing Portuguese language. When you're in Estonia or Poland, we have not homogenized our national identity. But we know that if we did not find a different way of working together on the European continent, which has economic benefits and political benefits, that we know we can repeat the mistakes of history. And I would find it very surprising if some people in America suddenly decided that we should be encouraged to go backwards rather than go forwards. Now, coming to the new administration, of course, we are as perplexed as many over exactly the direction of a number of policy areas in the administration. But I want to say that we have had very good contacts with the new administration. Very early on, we had Commissioner Avramopoulos, responsible for migration and home affairs, who met with his counterpart, Secretary Kelly at Homeland Security. Federica Mogherini, the High Representative and Vice President, was here only a few days later and met with Mr. Tillerson, Secretary of State, one of the, I think the second. I think Foreign Minister Gabriel was the first European foreign minister to meet Mr. Tillerson. Ms. Mogherini was the second. Met with people in the White House, close advisors of the President, met a number of senators, and came away very reassured with what we heard in terms of the policies which concern us. Vice President Pence led a strong U.S. delegation to the Munich Security Conference, and there again some very strong and clear messages were given, which greatly reassured the European counterparts. And Vice President Pence then moved on, and I must say we were grateful for this, that he took the trouble to come to Brussels, and he met with the institutions. He met with President Tusk as President of the European Council, President Juncker, and the High Representative Federica Mogherini. And those were excellent meetings. And he also expressed public support at the press conference with President Tusk for close cooperation between the United States and the European Union. So this has been very reassuring, and we feel fairly confident that we can work with this new administration. But of course, like everyone who is observing this new administration, we understand that policy is not yet fully settled. And that there is still a debate going on. There are still many key appointments to be made in the bureaucracy, and so I think we have to be patient, and we have to keep an open mind as to how policy is going to develop. But on the key areas which potentially gave rise for concern, I think particularly with regard to NATO, we feel that very strong statements have been made reaffirming the commitment to NATO. We understand that there is the issue of burden sharing. This is primarily a NATO issue, and I don't speak for NATO. The 2% target that NATO member states have signed up to will, of course, I'm sure, be implemented. But I would just like to point out that from a European Union perspective, one of the most important things about this, it's not just the absolute amount of money we spend in Europe on defense. When you add up all our defense budgets, we are actually the second largest defense spenders in the world, ahead of Russia, ahead of China, after the United States, of course. But as Federica Mogherini points out, we perhaps spend 50% of what the United States does on defense, but we get about 15% of the output. In other words, there are huge inefficiencies in the way in which we spend our money because we have 28 separate budget military structures. We have many more weapons systems than you do in the US. We're not gaining the economies of scale which could be had through closer integration. And one of the things we've started to do within the European Union is to look, are there ways in which we can help member states cooperate more closely to spend more productively and to get better value for money about defense expenditure. And this is, we're doing it as the European Union in the best interest of our member states, but any contribution that is made through that will, of course, contribute to the effectiveness of those member states who are also members of NATO and to NATO's overall objectives. And we are also able to cooperate much more closely between the European Union and NATO than we have in the past. And I think the days of a debate about EU versus NATO are over. I think everyone understands that we need the complementarity between what the objectives of NATO and what we do in Europe. On the issue of foreign policy more generally, I think we've been very reassured by what has been said about Russia and sanctions. We have just renewed the sanctions against Ukraine, against Russia relative to their behavior in Ukraine. And I think we are absolutely in agreement with this administration that the sanctions against Russia are there as a consequence of Russian behavior, and that those sanctions must remain in place until such time as that behavior is changed. It's not that we think that sanctions are a permanent policy or that we want a policy of confrontation with Russia if this is not necessary. On the other hand, the situation in Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea, the interference in the eastern provinces is a very serious breach of the security practices which we've had in Europe under the Helsinki Agreement, the inviolability of borders by force, and interference in affairs of your neighbor. This is very unacceptable behavior, and we believe the sanctions will have to remain in place. And everything we have heard from this administration leads us to conclude that this is a common view. Equally, on relations with Iran, which we know are complex, Federica Mogherini is responsible for implementing the Joint Common Plan of Action to prevent Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons. She has made it very clear when she was here that she will view her job to be that everyone has to live up to their part of that deal. The Iranians have to live up to what they have committed to, and the rest of us who signed the deal have to do the same. And she came away reassured that that it would be possible to take forward this deal, even if we still know that we will have many challenges with Iran on other areas which are not directly linked to this deal. Their missile program, their financing of terrorism and activity in the neighborhood, their consistent death threats against Israel. These are all major problems and human rights issues. These are major problems between us and Iran. But the nuclear deal has meant that we are dealing with a country which has these problems, but which is not backed by a nuclear weapon capability, which was the main purpose of the agreement. So in these areas, I think we feel a great deal of reassurance. We know that there will be other areas of greater difficulty. Trade, I think, is one where we don't yet know the fully settled view of this administration. We've heard slightly conflicting things from within the administration. We are waiting for the appointment of the United States Trade Representative, future Ambassador Lighthizer. His hearing, I think, is this week, but we don't know quite when there will be the confirmation, because there's an additional complication, if I understand, about needing some kind of waiver for previous activity in his private capacity. But we hope very much that he will be quickly appointed, and we are very anxious to open a conversation with this administration on how we take forward the trade relations between the European Union and the United States. I have heard talk that maybe people would like separate deals with our individual member states. I don't have to tell you that this is economic nonsense, not because there's a provision in the treaty which forbids it. Yes, there is a provision in the treaty. Legally, member states may not negotiate. But the important thing to understand is, why is that the case? That is the case because we have a single market. We have a common customs tariff. So when you negotiate with the European Union, and it's a bilateral deal between Canada and the EU, between Japan and the EU, between Mercosur and the EU, what you get is access to a market of 500 million people, regardless of at what point of entry you bring in your product. When you invest in a member state of the European Union, you get to sell your product or your services across the entire geography of those 28 member states. In those circumstances, you could not possibly have bilateral trade deals which could be conflicting or contradictory. It just doesn't make economic sense. So forgive me, when people say, well, why do you prevent your member states from doing separate trade deals? We don't prevent them. The member states, when they signed up to the single market, themselves acknowledged that you would have to have a single European trade policy if you are to have a well-functioning internal market, which is hugely in America's benefit. 80% of foreign direct investment in this country comes from the European Union. We do roughly $5.5 trillion of trade across the Atlantic each year. We are one of your largest markets. You are one of the biggest investors in Europe, and your companies make more money out of their investments, say, in Ireland or in Belgium, just to take two relatively small European member states, than they do in anywhere else in the world, including in China. These are the metrics which just show the enormous strength of the economic relationship. There are roughly 7 million jobs in the United States which depend on trade and investment with the European Union. So this is a hugely important economic relationship. Now, we've been negotiating on a possible trade deal for the last 3.5 years. There's now an interruption with the new administration. We wait to hear how this new administration wants to go forward in trade relations with Europe. Cecilia Malmström, the European Commissioner responsible, will be here, we hope, at the end of April. We very much hope that future Ambassador Lighthizer will be in place at that time. And we want to have a very open conversation in which we listen to what the administration has to say and we see how we deal with it. Our general view is that the logic which led us to start negotiations on a trade agreement, the intensity of the relations, the possibility of the productivity gains from eliminating duplicatory regulatory practices on both sides of the Atlantic, the cost of reducing the cost of business, that logic is still there. How and in what way we take it forward with this administration, we wait to see once we have someone in place that we can have that discussion with. Another area where I think we will need to have some discussions is, of course, the whole area of climate change and the decarbonization of the economy, which, as you know, is not just an issue for the US or for the European Union. It's a planetary issue, quite literally. We know that there may be some nuances there, and again, we wait to see how we can engage with this administration on this very important project. The Paris Agreement was a hugely important step forward for the international community. Contrary to Kyoto, we managed to get on board all the major players to a common commitment of taking action to fight climate change. And we know that climate change is probably the greatest security threat any of us face. This has been identified in particular by the US military, that the single greatest security threat to the United States is actually climate change because of its enormous consequences for destabilizing regions and neighborhoods, and the risk, for example, of climate change migration is absolutely huge. So this is a common problem. Paris was a great step forward, but it's only a platform. It needs to be built on and to be reviewed and to be taken forward. We know we may not have an identity of view with this administration on this issue, but we will want to continue the engagement on this point because the European Union is very committed to addressing this issue. Also because we think the business case for moving to a carbon-free economy is absolutely convincing. And I think, speaking to industry here in the United States, I think people absolutely get that. So these are all the issues on which we have to discuss with this administration. We do this, of course, in the context of change here, but we also do it in a context of change in the European Union. We have the decision of the United Kingdom to withdraw from the European Union. I will not hide from you that I view that decision with deep regret. From so many perspectives, it's hard to say. As an Irishman, certainly it poses a very big problem for Ireland. Joint membership of the European Union was a key element of the peace process in Northern Ireland, as was, by the way, the enormous contribution of the United States. So there were many elements that came together. But one of the great facilitators was joint membership of the European Union. The UK departure from the European Union is going to pose a challenge for that. It's going to pose a challenge for the Irish economy. So Ireland, as an Irishman, I have a particular regret. I also regret the decision of Britain no longer to feel a sense of shared destiny with the rest of us. But, you know, that's politics. They've made their choice. We respect that. We will have to try and figure out how we do this in the most adult way possible, which works for the UK and which works for the 27. The 27 have very clearly decided that we will continue on this journey of European integration. There will be further discussion on this issue in Rome on the occasion of the 60th anniversary of the signing of the Treaty of Rome. There are certainly issues to be discussed about the future of the European Union. We're facing very important elections this week in the Netherlands, the end of April and May in France and in Germany in September. And Europe is a part of that domestic political debate. What kind of Europe do we want? What is the balance between what we do together as Europeans and what we retain at the national level? How do we make this process accountable, democratically legitimate, transparent, and at the same time effective, so that we don't always spend an excessively long time to get to decisions that are needed for our continent to function? These are discussions you're not completely unfamiliar with in the United States. And again, I'm not saying we're building a United States of Europe, but we are engaged in a discussion about how you manage the different levels of government, from federal to the national to the subnational. Take a country like Germany, which is actually a highly federalized country in itself, and then it becomes part of the European Union, so you've got multiple layers. And all of these, the interaction of these different systems of government are important questions, and there are legitimate disagreements, political disagreements in Europe. Some people don't think we should be as integrated as we are. Some people would like us more integrated. Some people would like us more integrated in some areas and less integrated in others. So this is a political process, ladies and gentlemen. And it doesn't always look very pretty from outside. Sometimes it looks like we're squabbling and fighting. Well, it's because there are genuine differences of opinion, and how we build this and take it forward will be a subject of discussion. But I think it's very clear to me that there is a firm commitment of the 27 to continue this process, which has brought us so many benefits in so many different ways, and I'm confident that we will do so. And I hope that in that context, we can continue the very close partnership with the United States. As I said, from the very early days, the United States has been such a close ally and friend of this process. Of course, at the end of the day, what we Europeans want for ourselves is our choice. And it's on us to decide how best we organize our continent and what choices we make about integration and moving more closely together. And we will make those choices in our own way, and we will get there. But we greatly value the partnership of the United States, from the initial impetus which was given by General Marshall 70 years ago to the very strong partnership which has been shown down the years. And frankly, the world liberal order, which we have jointly built together in the aftermath of the Second World War, including the United Nations, NATO, the World Trade Organization as it now is, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades as it was then. All of this has been our common design of how to put some order on the difficult issue of international relations. And I think it has been a huge success. It is challenged now from different perspectives, emerging economies, changing views of how all of this should function. Some people in the developing countries feel they don't have the same ownership of that system that they would like. How do we bring them into the system in a way that means they have ownership, but we still feel it meets its original objectives? These are very legitimate questions. How we make the United Nations work more effectively, I think nobody denies that's a discussion we could usefully have. But we hope we will be able to have this discussion with this administration and with the United States in the spirit of friendship and partnership and alliance, which has kept us together so closely in the last decades, and which we hope will continue to do so in the future. I know we're living in a period of uncertainty, but I think when you have uncertainty, you go back to the basics, and I think the basics will show that we have a huge stake in your success and your prosperity, just as you have a huge success in our prosperity, in our stability, and in peace and stability on the European continent. And I'm quite sure that we can cooperate very closely to achieve those objectives as we go forward. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. We'll now go out to the audience for questions. If you wouldn't mind raising your arms and waiting for the mic and making sure your question's a question. We'll start here with Phil Levy, our Senior Fellow from the Council.
Thank you, Ambassador. I wanted to come back to a trade point, actually to a couple of points that you made on this. You mentioned that the U.S. was not quite ready to engage because we don't have a U.S. trade representative. Europe has its own issues on trade in the sense that the relationship between the rest of the EU and the UK and where that's headed has yet to be worked out. And the UK constitutes a fairly significant portion of the European economy. Do you see any constructive role, assuming the US gets its people in place, constructive role for the US to play in working out what a post-Brexit trade relationship will look like?
Brexit has been likened to a divorce. I don't know if any of you have had marriages that you've been close to, people get divorced. My experience is you keep as much distance as you can from both parties. I think we would greatly, we obviously look to America playing a constructive role in these discussions. At the end of the day, these are discussions we're going to have between the UK and the rest of us to find the sensible way forward. And I think, it will not be easy. But I think we will have to work that out between us. Obviously, we would wish the United States to be as constructive as possible towards the whole process, but I think this is a European problem that we have to find a solution for.
Yeah, David Sheffer from Northwestern Law School, please. Sorry, David, if you can take the mic, please.
Yes, thanks. Ambassador, yesterday, Scottish First Minister Nicola Sturgeon announced the intention of her government, provided the Scottish Parliament consents, to seek a referendum for independence by 2018 or 2019, all in light of the Brexit negotiations. Can you plot for us an EU perspective on Scotland's continued engagement with the EU if those developments unfold? Thank you.
I think it's very difficult to speculate on that subject. I mean, firstly, the question of a second referendum and how that would be managed is a matter for the UK's internal constitutional discussion. I mean, the last referendum which took place was done with the agreement of Westminster in certain parameters. As I understand it, that would be needed again for a future referendum. So I think there's an internal UK discussion that has to be had, which frankly is not a matter for the rest of us. The position of a future independent Scotland in relation to the European Union is the subject of great legal discussion, but I don't think this is the moment for that. For how the special position of Scotland or the special position of Northern Ireland or other bits of the United Kingdom that are going to have to, that can be the subject of the discussion. I think, again, these problems will have to be put on the table in a constructive way and see if there are solutions which can be found which square the circle of the United Kingdom leaving the European Union, while some bits of it might need to retain some kind of connection to Europe. I don't personally have any answers or solutions to those problems, but I think this is all going to be part of the discussion. And clearly it's going to be a complicated process. I mean, there's another issue there which is sometimes mentioned and sometimes forgotten about, which is the status of Gibraltar, for example. So I mean, there are going to be, unfortunately, in this, not just the trade issues, but there's going to be some complicated legal and constitutional questions which are going to have to be addressed. But I don't have any particular insights to offer you today.
Next question, right up here, please, in the front row. Wait, can you wait for the mic, please, Tom? It's right there. Thanks.
5 years from now, in what way, if any, is the EU more likely to be integrated?
Look, I don't know, because we don't have an agreed endpoint. I mean, I've been working in the European Union. I joined the European Commission in 1979. My first job was desk officer for Comecon. Anyone in this room remember what Comecon was? It was the Soviet equivalent of the common market. And the question of what relations we would have between the EEC and Comecon was the subject of learned doctoral theses, by the way, most of which are gathering dust somewhere, I suspect. If you had said to me in 1979, when, by the way, Greece was just about to join, 30 years from now, the European Union will be 28 member states, of whom all the countries of Comecon would be members of the European Union, that we would have seen the collapse of the Berlin Wall, that we would have a euro currency shared by 19 of our member states and the second largest reserve currency in the world, that we would have freedom of movement throughout the European Union, so you can drive from Helsinki to Lisbon without going through a border check or a customs check. You don't even have to change your currency unless you stop in Denmark to buy gas. If you had said to me in 1979, that is what the future would hold, I would have laughed. I would have said, impossible. We couldn't do that. So I don't want now to say to you where we're going to be 5 years from now, because we still haven't figured out where this ends. And perhaps it doesn't actually end anywhere. It continues in the way that we have built it, doing what we need to do at European level in response to analysis that that's how you better solve a problem. Look at the migration crisis and the refugee crisis, which caused huge strain. But the conclusion was that it became a crisis because we were trying to manage it at national level instead of on a continental scale. If you manage that crisis on a continental scale, it isn't a crisis. 3 or 4 million refugees trying to get into Europe of 500 million people should not turn into a crisis. On the other hand, if you try to put those people on a Greek island, then it turns into a major crisis. So here again, we have shown the creation of a European Border and Coast Guard Service. If you said to me 2 years ago, could you imagine creating a European Border and Coast Guard Service? I would have said, no, I don't think there's a will for that. So my point is not to dodge your question. It's just to say that I think we build Europe progressively and iteratively, doing the things at European level that we decide are better done that way, because that's what we learn. And so we may have made some great leap forward in 5 years, or we may look very much like it does now. I honestly don't know what the answer will be. And I don't know that there will be a dramatic moment a sort of foundation moment, which some people imagine that at some point we all miraculously decide now we're going to have the United States of Europe. I think we will always be in this iterative process of doing certain things at European level because we get better outcomes, because it works better for our citizens, and because that's what we are able to do. And on the other hand, always working on the assumption that we want to leave the maximum to the autonomy and the independence of our individual member states, which they rightly value greatly. So I mean, I'm not dodging the question. I don't have an answer where we'll be in 5 years. We could have had some important steps forward. We might still be pretty much where we are today, which is already very highly integrated.
One of the questions from our online platform, how do you see the rise of populism undermining the cohesion of the EU?
Well, I think it is clear that in Europe, as in the United States, there is perhaps as a legacy of the financial crash and the Great Recession, there's a certain disillusionment with establishment politics. I mean, this is a pattern you see across all our democratic societies, a tendency to vote for new parties or for independence or for more extreme populist parties. And I think we have to understand why this is happening. I think we can't just say, oh, you can't vote for these extreme parties. We have to try and figure out what it is that people feel the established political system is not delivering for them, and how do we correct that? I am relatively confident that in Europe the center will hold, if I can quote Yeats. I think that we, of course, wait to see what the results are in the Netherlands this week, in France in a month's time or 2 months' time, and in Germany. And of course, opinion polls are not great guides anymore. But I think the likelihood of nationalist, extremist, populist parties actually gaining power in any of our member states is very slim. But there are lessons to be learned, and I think we have to listen to what people are saying. I personally think we can be nationalistic in the positive sense of that word. We can be proud of our nationality. We can be proud of our countries. We can want the best for our countries without feeling that that somehow implies a degree of superiority or a degree of being more right than your neighbor or than people of a different nationality. I fear that some of the ideologies that are being put about by some of these parties are potentially quite dangerous. But in the end, rather like President Obama when he was leaving, I tend to be optimistic. I think good is more powerful than evil, and I trust very much to the common sense at the end of the day of voters to deliver sensible outcomes. But we have a democratic process, and we'll have to wait the outcome of those elections this year before we know for certain. But this will be an important year with a number of very important elections, which will, in my view, certainly play a strong role, to your question, sir, about the future direction of Europe over the next decade.
Next question from the audience. Okay, I'll take one more from this. A brief one, perhaps. Who do you think speaks for the Trump administration on foreign policy, and in particular the transatlantic relationship?
Well, people often used to say to me, Mr. Ambassador, what's your answer to Henry Kissinger's question of who does he call when he wants to speak to Europe? And I want to say this, that the answer I gave was under the Obama administration. I used to say, well, what number can you give me to call in Washington when I want to know what America thinks? Because actually, your system is remarkably decentralized under any administration. There are different centers of power. There are the White House, the State Department. So it was ever thus. So, I mean, the fact that we don't at this point have a perfectly worked out narrative that is shared by every bit of the administration doesn't particularly surprise me. So we will talk with the White House, we talk with the State Department, with the new Secretary of State, who is new in the job, who is clearly a very intelligent man who is also wants to understand what is new to him. And we will continue that dialogue with everyone in the U.S. administration and in Congress, by the way, because one of the things that's so important in this country to understand for foreigners is that Congress plays a huge role, particularly in this area. So the answer is you have to talk with all the people who have influence and who have something to say in the formulation of policy, and that's what we will continue to do.
Great. Oh, the Minister from Ireland, please. We'll have a question. Thank you. 1 second for the mic, please, Minister.
Thank you. And Ambassador, thank you for a very excellent presentation. I just would like you to comment, please, maybe on the Northern Ireland peace process and just see what you think may be the implications for Brexit on Northern Ireland.
Well, Minister,
You may need to come back for another programme.
I think you're better qualified to answer that question than I am. No, I can only repeat what I said. The peace process owes so much to many people. By the way, a number of them, my former colleagues in the Department of Foreign Affairs, Irish diplomats and civil servants who invested hugely, Irish politicians who invested hugely, the politicians in the north of Ireland, and also the people of violence in Northern Ireland who eventually got the message. It was my great privilege to participate in a remarkable experience here in the United States, the Faith and Politics pilgrimage to Alabama, led by Congressman John Lewis, where we visited Birmingham and Selma and Montgomery and learned the story of the civil rights movement and the remarkable courage of the people who led that movement. And what struck me so deeply was the commitment to nonviolence and how they clung to that in face of huge provocation and the temptation to cede to the reflex of revenge, which unfortunately, Minister, as you know, we did in Ireland. We started out as a non-violent movement in Northern Ireland, and then we lost our way with huge consequences. And it's taken us a long time to come back to that. And it's a great tribute to all the people who have done that, including the United States. But the point I want to make, also the European Union. And I think the joint membership of the European Union was absolutely key to the peace process in Northern Ireland because it helped square the circle. For Unionists, they got the guarantee that there would be no change in the status of Northern Ireland without the agreement of the majority of people in Northern Ireland. And therefore there was a border, and it was there, and they were firmly part of the United Kingdom. But joint membership of the European Union meant that that border didn't actually exist in practice. So for nationalists in Northern Ireland, they could live and work and act as though we were living on one island, because you could work in the north and live in the south, you could live in the south, you could work in the north. Goods and products, milk products are made in the north, come down to the south, get processed, go back up to the north. These days in Ireland, you don't even know there's a border there. But, I mean, there is one, and let's be clear. Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom and will remain there until such time as a majority of people decide otherwise, and that's a very important guarantee. But in practice, you live your life as though it's one island. Brexit changes that. And, we have to figure out, and I know, Minister, your government is deeply committed, as is the British government, to somehow that not changing too much. But the fact is, Brexit does change. We are no longer going to be joint members of the European Union, and that is going to have implications one way or another for that frontier. So I sincerely hope that we can manage this in a way that maintains the momentum of the peace process, and I'm sure that's the commitment of everyone. But it is an unfortunate byproduct of Brexit, and it's going to take a lot of political skill to manage it.
Just one more question. Yeah, sorry, I'll take one from the audience first, please. Gentleman in the back.
If the U.S. proceeds with cutting humanitarian aid and reducing the inflow of immigrants from troubled areas around the world, how is the EU prepared to respond?
Well, I mean, I have seen talk of a dramatic cut in U.S. development aid and humanitarian aid. The European Union is the largest donor of overseas development assistance in the world. Nearly 60% of global overseas development assistance comes from the European Union and its member states. We're also the largest donor of humanitarian assistance. And, I was talking earlier about defense spending. I sometimes think that a contribution to global security needs also to take into account the huge importance of that kind of expenditure to complement anything that you might want to do militarily. And I think that sometimes sight is lost a bit of Europe's enormous contribution to that sort of soft power side of collective security. The United States is also a significant donor, particularly in the area of humanitarian aid. We would hope that would be maintained because I think it is very, very important. The crisis in Syria, the humanitarian crisis, the refugee crisis, largely flowed from the lack of funding for the multilateral organizations responsible for looking after the refugees in Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. they had a shortfall of nearly, they only had cover of 60%, and it was when people in those countries realized that the money was running out, the World Food Programme wouldn't be able to provide food, the UNHCR would not be able to provide medical cover and shelter, that they started walking towards Europe. So the importance of this spending is not to be underestimated, and I know that there will be a debate in the United States on this issue. I know that many people in Congress, Federica Mogherini met with Senator Lindsey Graham when she was here, who feels very strongly that the United States needs to maintain that. So this is an example, Niamh, of the importance of the dialogue, not just with the administration, but also with Congress, because in the end it will be the Congress that decides how much money is spent, and we will certainly be making the strong case as to why the United States should maintain its share of spending in this way. On the question of refugees, look, the United States does take in many refugees under a resettlement program. You have a fantastic program. It's, I call it a deluxe program, because you do it in the sense of you take people from resettlement, not so much coming across your border. You take them from camps. You take a long time to assess them, to vet them, to work with local communities here who can integrate them and provide them with employment and reception. So it's a very sophisticated program, which, by the way, I think offers many, many guarantees for the security of this country. It would be a shame if that program were to be reduced or cut. It's not the numbers that are so significant. I mean, in terms of the numbers we're facing with in the refugee crisis, it's a relatively small number of people, but it's a huge contribution to what is a major global problem. There are 65 million displaced people globally, and this needs global action. And the United States, as Europe, as our Arab partners, other countries, all have to be part of finding that solution. And we hope the United States will continue to play a constructive role in addressing this issue.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's all we have time for today, but please join me in thanking Ambassador David O'Sullivan for his remarks. Thanks very much. We're adjourned.